In this next section, we're going to look at how matter moves through ecosystems. We're going to talk about a few different systems, but they're called biogeochemical cycles, is what it's called, the part where matter is actually moving through. So it's moving similar to energy, but it has some different components to it as well. So let's look at the word first, biogeochemical. Bio meaning life. So some of the chemicals that we're going to talk about and the matter we're going to talk about moves through the living portions of ecosystems. Remember, ecosystems are made up of abiotic portions and biotic portions. So the bio part is looking at that living part. The geo part is looking at the abiotic. So how does it move through the core, crust, and mantle? And then the chemical part is where we're going to look at specific chemical compounds and how they cycle through Earth. And we call them the nutrient cycles. So they're driven by either solar radiation or gravity. We look at the solar radiation part, especially in conjunction with the bio portion, also the chemical, but mostly the bio, because we're looking at how when solar radiation comes in, we have photosynthesis that occurs, and that helps to drive the carbon cycle in particular. And then we also look at gravity. Really, without gravity on our planet, we wouldn't have much to speak of. We wouldn't have really anything to talk about, because our gravitational pull holds our atmosphere into place, which allows all of these cycles to be happening, because it also protects, and it's also holding in the ozone layer, which is our protection from UV light from the sun. And so gravity allows us to have this layered atmosphere, which protects our planet, which allows all these cycles to occur. You don't see nutrient cycling occurring on the moon, or we haven't found it on any other planet, because there is no atmosphere. So it's very important. Gravity also makes things move down, so especially when we're talking about the water cycle, it's actually helping to drive the water cycle. So we are going to talk about the water cycle, carbon cycle, nitrogen cycle, and the phosphorus cycles. We'll talk about how people interact with these different cycles, and we're going to look at where the reservoirs are. A reservoir is a storage location. So we have reservoirs for water that help to supply the Phoenix area with water. We have Roosevelt Lake, we have Lake Mead. These are areas where we store large amounts of water. That would be considered a reservoir. We also have reservoirs for the other nutrients that we'll talk about as we look at each one individually. We have nutrients that are at different points in the cycle, and so they're at different areas in different reservoirs during different periods of time. So the first one we're going to look at is the water cycle. This is the one that you should be the most familiar with. Generally, we start talking about the water cycle when in the very early primary grades, kind of come back to it over and over again. So most of our water vapor, it comes from the oceans, because the oceans are so big, right, that a lot of evaporation occurs in those areas. So when we look at the amount of water that's coming from the land, most of it's actually coming out of plants and through the process of transpiration. So plants on their leaves, usually on the underside of their leaves, have little openings in them called stomata. And the stomata open and close, so they open to allow carbon dioxide to come in and oxygen to go out. But when they allow oxygen to go out, one of the byproducts of photosynthesis is water. And so they're also releasing water into the atmosphere. So some of our plants are specialized, and so they have smaller stomata, or they might not have stomata at all. So like our cacti, the spines on the cactus are actually modified leaves. The plant has adapted over time and evolved so that the leaves no longer lose water to the atmosphere, and they actually don't photosynthesize in their leaves anymore. They photosynthesize through their skin, which has a thick waxy coating on the outside to protect them from water loss. So when we look at the amount of transpiration that occurs, it's going to occur in different amounts in different biomes around the world. You're going to see less transpiration loss occurring in deserts, because that we have more specialized plants that have protected themselves against water loss so that they don't dry out, right? So we're going to have more transpiration that occurs in areas around the equator where we have our tropical rainforests and in our areas that have lusher vegetation than we will in areas where we have primarily deserts. We don't have a whole lot of water on the planet that's available for human use. There's only about 3% of the water that is actually fresh water on the planet, but a large portion of that is tied up in ice caps. And so when we look at what we can actually get to and access, it's just a very small fraction of what the amount of water is on our planet. So in this one, you might need to pause for a minute if you need to be able to fill out your notes on this. But for a lot of you, some of this is going to be some review. There's some things that you should be familiar with, where you have evaporation occurring, condensation happens in the clouds, right? Precipitates back down, we get runoff, and that can collect in our rivers, lakes, and streams, and then ending up down into the ocean. When the water soaks down into the ground, that's called infiltration. That's what we're looking at over here. We'll talk about infiltration quite a bit, especially in the second semester when we talk about food supplies and agriculture, because infiltration is really important at that point because it infiltrates down into the aquifer. And our aquifers are hugely important because those are our big underground storage areas of water that we tap with wells. The groundwater still moves and it can end up going into the ocean as well. But when we overuse our aquifers, it actually doesn't keep out the salt water in those areas, and so we have saltwater intrusion, which is another form of pollution that we'll look at next semester. We have lots of evaporation that's occurring. In some areas though, when we have people that are impacting our land by using it, if they're cutting down trees, if they're removing vegetation, that's going to increase the amount of runoff, which could increase flooding. It's also going to increase the amount of sedimentation that happens in rivers, lakes, and streams. As the increased runoff happens, it's going to take more dirt with it, and that's going to get deposited in those bodies of water. The next cycle we're going to look at is the carbon cycle. So the carbon cycle is dependent upon plants because this is how we go from carbon dioxide to oxygen and back again. So carbon dioxide is not a huge portion of our atmosphere, thankfully. It's a smaller portion because it is toxic to us. So we wouldn't want it to have it in our atmosphere quite that much. It is an essential component of every living thing. Carbon is of every living thing on our planet. And so carbon itself is essential, and it's essential that it continues to cycle through our atmosphere and back into our plants to make it available for living things to use. So when we look at it in our atmosphere, it is essential in our atmosphere because we talked a little bit about the greenhouse effect, and the greenhouse effect is a natural process, once again, that keeps our planet at a stable temperature, and without it our planet would be very, very cold. So we don't want too much of a greenhouse effect because then we go the other way and the temperatures get too warm. Venus has a really, really intense greenhouse effect, and so it's really hot on the surface of Venus because of their greenhouse effect. So we need to keep in that nice stable zone. So when we look at what contributes to the carbon in the atmosphere, aerobic respiration is what happens at the cellular level. Aerobic means that it happens in the presence of oxygen. So this is what plants do. It's not you and I breathing in and out, although we do contribute carbon dioxide when we breathe out. But aerobic respiration in particular, we're talking about plants and when they go through photosynthesis. And then some human impacts that we've seen as well, with pretty much burning anything is going to put carbon up into the atmosphere. So here's our global carbon cycle. So from the last slide, we talked a little bit about forest fires. Anything that's red pointing up is showing carbon dioxide going into the atmosphere in a way that's affected by humans. So forest fires, and that's not saying that forest fires didn't happen before people. It just means that because of the way we've chosen to manage our forests, and we've chosen to reduce the amount of fires, when we get fires now, they tend to be bigger than they were before. And so we're actually burning more land area because we chose to suppress fires. The suppression of fires allowed a lot of plant material to build up, lots of sticks and pine needles and all the stuff that falls out of the trees, and then the trees themselves when they fall down and die, all that stuff ended up staying on the ground, and we don't have little fires weren't cleaning it out. And so now when the fires happen, instead of just little fires cleaning out the few things that fell on the ground, now all that stuff builds up and it makes the fire hotter, and so it kills all the trees too. We talked a little bit about things that are natural pathways that are both putting carbon in and taking carbon out of the atmosphere. We talked about respiration and photosynthesis. We have, which is pretty much anywhere you see the plants, and then it's moving through our food chains. The animals, when they die and they decompose, the carbon can either be released back into the atmosphere, or it can actually go down into the soil as a fertilizer. One of our big sinks, one of our big reservoirs, reservoir and sink can be used interchangeably, but one of our big reservoirs for carbon is the atmosphere. So that's a big one. That's where probably the majority of our carbon is being stored. We have it in the atmosphere. We have it in plants and animals, would be another reservoir where it's stored. It's stored in your body. Okay, we are all carbon-based life forms. It can be stored in the soil as things die and decompose. It can be stored there, and it's also stored in the ocean water itself. Carbon will diffuse from the atmosphere into the water where the air is touching the ocean surface. And we also have carbon that's stored in ocean floors. So as marine animals die and they fall down to the bottom of the ocean and they decompose there, that becomes a sink or a reservoir for carbon as well. As they build up over time and compress down, they form limestone, and then there's carbon that's stored in the limestone. The nitrogen cycle happens, so there's a component of it in the atmosphere. That will be one area where nitrogen is stored, and then also in plants. So plants can't use direct N2 or nitrogen gas that comes directly from the atmosphere. They have to have a little bit of help, and that's where the nitrogen fixation comes in. So they need to have, there's bacteria that's in the soil that are nitrogen fixers, and sometimes they're attached to the roots of plants, and sometimes they're just living freely in the soil close to the roots of the plants, and they actually fix the nitrogen, and then the plant can use it, converts it into a usable form in order for the plants to actually use them. So it says in here lightning, yeah, it can be fixed in that way, but that's not it's not a significant portion of the nitrogen. The most significant portion of nitrogen is being fixed by bacteria. So denitrification is where it goes back into the nitrogen gas. So as things break down over time, there's bacteria that are decomposers that then release the nitrogen back into the atmosphere. So we have some bacteria that fixes it for us and some bacteria that releases it for us. So here's our nitrogen cycle. You see that this one, nitrogen has fewer pathways than carbon did or water does. Nitrogen, the human side of things, when we burn fossil fuels, we are releasing nitrogen oxides up into the atmosphere. When in second semester, when you start talking about air quality, all of these things come into play when we talk about air quality. Nitrogen is important for plant growth, and so if we don't have enough bacteria in the soil to fix the nitrogen for us, what we've done through our industrialized agricultural practices is we have made nitrogen-based fertilizers that we can put onto the plants so they'll grow better. And then when it rains and there's runoff, then those the nitrogen fertilizer stuff goes with it. So there's runoff from that. And this is what they're showing here in the stream going down through the center of your screen. So the nitrates can cause some issues with water quality as well because basically you're putting fertilizer into the water, and that's where we get algae blooms, which can be harmful in both freshwater and saltwater ecosystems. We do have some nitrogen that's stored like our carbon was down in our deep ocean sediments, but that then is no longer usable to plants until the ocean dries out and there's uplift that occurs. It's pretty much lost to us at that point. But we talked about our nitrogen moving through our food chains up in here, and we talked about it being fixed by bacteria and then also being denitrified by bacteria where it gets released back into the atmosphere. The phosphorus cycle is a little bit different. This is the only cycle that doesn't go through the atmosphere, so there's no airborne component here. It moves through Earth, the geo part, and it moves through plants and animals, but it doesn't move through the atmosphere at all. So phosphorus comes from rock formations. It is a primary limiting factor for plant growth. Because of that, it is a slow process to make more phosphorus. Earth has to make it through the rock cycle, and the rock cycle can take hundreds of millions of years. So really, we're mining for phosphorus right now to be able, because it's also, we need to use it. We use it for fertilizers, and once it's gone, this one is a non-renewable resource. It's going to take way longer than a lifetime in order for it to come back. So when you look at your, once again, much fewer pathways, right, in this one. So we have phosphorus that's in our ocean sediments, once again, getting compressed over time, becoming part of the rock cycle. It's going to move through, plants are going to uptake through the soil. They're going to uptake that phosphorus, and that's how it gets into our food chains. And here we do mine for phosphorus. Once again, phosphorus is a fertilizer, so when it gets into the waterways, it is going to impact water quality in those areas. So another way that phosphorus can enter through ecosystems is through waste products. So when we have sewage treatment plants and things like that, if there's runoff from those, that's going to increase the amount of phosphorus. So the only rock-based way of getting phosphorus is out of bat guano. We can use very old bat guano that's been there for a while. You can actually utilize that as a fertilizer, and there'll be phosphorus in it as well. But that would not be an economically significant means of getting phosphorus.